Have you ever stopped to think about how you actually learn to do something? You know, like riding a bike. Or why hearing a certain song can just, boom, transport you back to a specific moment? How do our brains do that? Well, today we're going to dive into exactly that. We're going to explore 5 huge theories that explain the fascinating and sometimes weird process of how we learn.
So here's the plan. We're going to look at learning by accident, then how rewards shape what we do. We'll touch on learning by association, those amazing aha moments of insight, and, of course, how much we learn just from watching other people. And we'll wrap it all up with how we make that learning actually stick.
All right, let's kick things off way back in the late 1800s with a psychologist named E.L. Thorndike. He had this idea that animals don't really use complex reasoning to learn. Instead, he figured it was all just simple trial and error. And, he set up a pretty clever experiment to prove it.
So, picture this. Thorndike puts a hungry cat inside what he called a puzzle box with some tasty food just outside. At first, the cat does everything you'd expect. It's clawing, it's biting, pacing back and forth, just trying anything and everything. Then, completely by accident, it pulls on a little loop and the door pops open. Now here's the cool part. The next time he puts the cat in the box, it gets out a little faster, and faster the time after that. It wasn't thinking it through, it just started repeating the one thing that actually worked.
And that's really the heart of trial and error learning. It all comes down to this. You try a bunch of things, you ditch what doesn't work, and you double down on what does. It's basically learning by doing, and let's be honest, usually by failing a few times first.
Okay, so that's learning by accident. But what if the learning isn't an accident at all? What if you could actually shape behavior on purpose? Well, that question leads us straight to the famous B.F. Skinner and his big idea, operant conditioning.
Skinner's whole theory was that the real key to learning isn't the action itself, but what happens right after you do it. Basically, we're way more likely to do something again if it's followed by a good thing, a reward, and less likely to do it if it's followed by a bad thing. Simple, right?
His famous Skinner box shows this perfectly. He put a rat in a box that had a little lever. If the rat happened to press the lever, a food pellet would drop in. That food pellet is a reward, or what we call positive reinforcement. And you can guess what happened. The rat very quickly learned, hey, if I press this lever, I get food. It's the exact same logic we use when we train a dog with treats or when a kid gets an allowance for doing their chores.
So far, we've talked about learning from our actions, but what about all those automatic responses that we don't even consciously control? This is where Ivan Pavlov and his famous dogs come into the picture.
So Pavlov noticed something obvious. Dogs drool when they see food. That's just a natural reflex, right? Well, he started ringing a bell, a totally meaningless sound, right before he'd give the dogs their food. And he did this over and over and over again. Pretty soon, an amazing thing happened. He could just ring the bell with no food anywhere in sight, and the dogs would start drooling. They had learned to associate the sound of the bell with getting fed.
And this explains so much about our own lives. Have you ever felt that little jolt of anxiety just from hearing the sound of a dentist drill? Yep, that's classical conditioning. Your brain has linked that sound to, well, a not-so-fun experience, and now the response is totally automatic.
Okay, so we've got learning by accident, by reward, and by association. But is that the whole story? What about those incredible moments when the solution to a really tough problem just pops into your head?
Well, a group of psychologists called the Gestalt psychologists said, no way. They argued that there's more to it than just automatic behaviors. They believed in a higher level of learning that involves really understanding the problem as a whole.
Take this amazing experiment by Wolfgang Kohler with a chimp named Sultan. Sultan really wants these bananas that are just outside his cage. He's got 2 sticks, but neither one is long enough to reach. So he tries with one, fails. Tries with the other, fails again. He gets super frustrated. But then he just stops. He looks at the 2 sticks, and you can almost see the light bulb go on over his head. In a sudden flash of insight, he puts the 2 sticks together, makes one long tool, and gets his bananas. That wasn't trial and error, that was a genuine aha moment.
And that's exactly what insight learning is.
It's that moment when all the pieces of a puzzle suddenly click into place, and you see the solution clearly. It's not about random guessing, it's about understanding how all the parts relate to each other.
Now, solving problems with a sudden flash of insight is pretty cool, but let's be real. A huge chunk of what we learn comes from something much simpler, just watching other people.
Psychologist Albert Bandura showed this so clearly with his famous Bobo doll experiment. He had a group of kids watch a video of an adult just going to town on this inflatable doll, hitting it, kicking it. Later, those kids were put in a room with the very same doll. And what do you think they did? They copied the adult's exact aggressive actions. It was a powerful demonstration that we learned so much just by watching and imitating.
I mean, think about it. This is how we learn almost everything important. We learn to talk. We learn social rules. We learn how to tie our shoes. Not because someone gave us a manual, but because we watched our parents, our friends, and everyone else around us.
So, we've covered 5 different ways we pick up new skills and knowledge. But for our last concept, let's ask a slightly different question. How does everything we already know affect our ability to learn something totally new?
Well, this idea is called transfer of learning, and it basically comes in 2 flavors. First, there's positive transfer. That's when something you already know helps you learn something new. For example, knowing how to ride a bicycle makes it way easier to learn to ride a motorcycle, right? But then there's negative transfer. That's when your old knowledge actually gets in the way. If you've spent your whole life driving on the right side of the road, trying to learn to drive on the left in another country can be, well, pretty tricky because your old habits are fighting you. So when you put it all together, from accidental discoveries and rewards to those sudden aha moments and just plain old observation, it becomes really clear. There is no single way to learn. It's this incredibly rich, complicated process that we are using every single day, whether we realize it or not. And that brings us to the end. But before you go, just think about your day. I bet you can find examples of all of these. Did you figure something out through trial and error? Did an old habit just kick in without you thinking? Or did you pick up a new trick just by watching someone else do it? Which of these learning theories have you actually lived through today?